these three different talking points is actually the um, the core argument, right, of the modern LGBT narrative, right? For it to occur, for them to successfully be able to propagate their ideologies, they have to base it on certain foundation and certain views. And so they had to combine between certain things that are not supposed to be combined and separate between certain things that are supposed to be together. And then they also, like, almost like, a scare tactic, right? To make people feel guilty, they drew an equivalence between race and gender and, race and gender you're born with, and then your sexual orientation. Can somebody close that door? Jazakumullah khair. And can one of the sisters please close that door at the back? Thank you. Gentlemen, can you guys close that door at the back? No, it's not your fault. It was open. Jazakumullah khair. All right, because I already hear complaints that my voice is low, and then there's sound interfering, and it's just not gonna. Jazakumullah khair. Thank you. All right, so so the first part, right, we're going to talk about, because this is really, once again, we reiterated this a couple of times, and it's really important to understand this. At this point, the LGBT narrative discourse is taking more of a moral, line of argument. And so we talked about morality, how it's established, and so forth. So right now, this point is we're going to talk about how moral concepts can differ based on a person's worldview. And that should be something we understand, okay? Now, this is really important, especially when we talk about, so last week we talked about that the Western world had started moving away from a theocentric worldview to a, what kind of worldview? From a theocentric to a egocentric, right? Materialistic one that's driven by what we desire. We are the center of everything. So once we remove, right, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or religion, remove religion from the sphere of the environment that we live in. When religion becomes irrelevant to things such as, our sexual behavior, our life at large, what ends up happening is that people tend to feel that that they must, or that they have to, right, from their own accord, through personal, perhaps, experiences and subjective moral framework, to put something else in there in place. Because what's telling us what is right and wrong is not there anymore. And so we have to put something in place of that. And this holds the same true when it regards to sexuality. So when religion has no opinion anymore about it, then we become the individuals who place our opinion regarding sexuality. And what I mean by that is what would be considered right and wrong, right? What would be considered acceptable or not acceptable. And so people's emotions, their personal tastes, their sensibilities, even their desires would actually guide their notion of what would be considered acceptable sexual behavior. That's the reality of it, right? Because if Allah or religion is not going to decide, who's going to decide? It is us, okay? And we are naturally affected by our biases. Whether, once again, it's our experiences that brings us subjective experiences, ideologies, our personal tastes, once again, even our own desires. So I'm going to add to that contemporary moral and ethical discourse replaces the whole central concept with substitutes. Okay, so essentially we're going to substitute ideas in there. And what kind of ideas are we going to substitute? So the Western society substitute ideas such as freedom, individual autonomy, authenticity, and consent. And we want to look at each one of those from the Western perspective and the Islamic perspective. And it's really important for us to understand and how to argue this, okay? So, freedom, okay? In popular culture, it is understood as what? What is freedom? Define freedom. Do whatever you want to do. Essentially, right? Um, can somebody put any sort of boundaries or rules for your freedom? No, because then it's not freedom, right? So essentially that's what it is, right? So when we talk about the popular culture of what freedom is, really it's understood that it is almost like a radical movement of eliminating any sort of external barrier, right? To achieve what? What do they want to achieve? Satisfaction, happiness, essentially, right? So the whole idea is that this freedom, when a person talks about freedom, it is they want to remove any sort of external barriers so that they achieve what they perceive as happiness. And remember, last week we talked about the whole notion of idea of happiness in the Western society's mind has been tightly, right, intertwined with achieving our desires, right? If you act upon your desires, act upon your emotions, you will reach happiness, essentially. In Islam, on the other hand, freedom is based on what? What's freedom based on? I just hear sounds. Freedom of choice? How's that different from Western thought? Huh? I know, but how do we dictate what's the right choice? Because that's what the Western world will argue. Right? We are making the right choice, you're making the wrong choice. Well, how do we decide? Essentially, it's opinions, right? So why is my opinion right and yours wrong? Good, excellent. We need that qualifier. Good, excellent, right? So essentially, in Islam, right, freedom is tightly associated with submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is servitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which frees us from serving our desires, material things, and any sort of form of falsehood. So in our minds in Islam, true freedom is submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In the Western world society, true freedom is being able to freely do whatever you desire. Is that understood? Yes? All right. So here's one thing I'm going to mention. By nature, as human beings, we've been created inherently to become slaves to something. We will be slaves to something, right? Whether it is our desires, whether it is financial things, whether it is to materialistic things, or whether it's to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is our nature to focus, right, and make something our focus, and we dedicate our life and we do things for whatever we're focusing on. So we'll always tend to serve something. The matter is, what is it going to serve? That's the only question. And so to think that we free ourselves, right, by removing barriers, we are enslaving ourselves to our desires. That's what we picked. Now, by refusing all of those things and serving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then we made ourselves slaves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Which in the long run, obviously, that is what is best for us, immediate and long run. This is what Islam is, submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is, I'm saying this because there is no 100% freedom. This whole concept of 100% freedom does not exist. It doesn't. If it does, it leads to anarchy. Is that right? We have to put boundaries to it. But also your desires, you cannot be free to do whatever you desire. Does not work. Does not happen. But anyway, that's the difference. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, following your desires, satisfying yourself. Serving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All right, so it's pleasing ourselves and pleasing, you're right, they're not equal. I agree with you, they're not equal. But we can never deny that when we please Allah, we also please ourselves. It's that sweetness, that enjoyment that we have. Yes, of course for Muslims. Mm-hmm. No, I agree. But we're talking about the reality of paradigm of things, just how we use words, right? So the next concept that kind of got substituted to replace the central religion concepts. So there's concepts in religion. So these are things that are replacing those concepts. So one concept is being placed in there is freedom. The other one is individual autonomy. Okay, individual autonomy. And we did talk about that a little bit. So individual autonomy in the Western notion literally means, what does autonomy mean? Can you define autonomy? What is autonomy? Means what? To act on your own. It is very close. So the dictionary, the classical definition is giving oneself the law. That is autonomy. So giving yourself the law. You are in charge. That's what autonomy. I'm independent. Right? That's what autonomy is. So I regulate my actions. I give myself the law to do whatever I want. So which means that every person determines what is right and what is wrong without any sort of recourse from a higher power. That's what it means, autonomy. In Islam, by contrast, it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger alone that have the right to legislate and tell us what is right and wrong. Okay, so in the Western world, the whole thing about individual autonomy is I am the one that dictates what is right and what is wrong. In Islam, it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger that dictate what is right and what is wrong. And there is a huge difference between both of them. One, if we're the ones who decide it, it becomes subjective. On the other hand, if Allah decides, it becomes objective. If something becomes subjective, then really there is no way to determining what is right and wrong. Because subjective means it's based on the individual. Okay? If it becomes based on the individual, how do we figure out why is one person, why is the other right and the other one person is wrong? Why is this idea right and why is this idea wrong? Right? And then we resort to things such as voting. Right? Well, how does a vote determine what is right and wrong? It doesn't. Is that understood? So this is an important factor we have to understand. So these ideas that are in there, you're going to realize why it's causing a lot of shift and turns in making decisions and how things are being decided in this whole narrative. All right. Now the other thing that kind of placed in there was consent. The whole idea of consent. So we touched on this last week, but essentially in the modern world, it has come to glorify the whole idea of choice and consent. That's the only thing that you need, which means that as long as there is consent, any action you take is considered legitimate. It's considered moral and correct. Why? Because there is consent. No matter how weird it might sound, no matter how out of bounds it is, as long as the whole idea of there's two consenting parties, 3, 4, 10, makes no difference, then there is no wrong. It's legitimate. It is okay. All right? So that translates into how a person would behave essentially sexually has no bearing on his or her moral character as long as their act is consensual. Is that understood? Yes? All right. In Islam, choice on the other hand, right, choice and consent are balanced. So they're balanced by revelation, but also balanced by reason, which, so it's balanced with revelation and reason, with the other needs that are critical to human flourishing. So we have these three things that are being balanced, okay? Reason, revelation, and what the human beings need to flourish, such as, for example, maintenance of the family. Now, if you look at the other side, if the only thing that's required is consent, so, which means, in reality, this is why there is this movement, there is this phenomena that's happening that we no longer think that a person, for example, who would cheat on their spouse is in the wrong because it was consensual, okay? But also, they probably had their own reasons. They got pushed to it, whatever the case is. And I don't know if you guys are noticing this, but this whole idea of a person, right, stepping out of their own relationship and doing things that are inappropriate or cheating on their spouses, or whatever the case is starting not to be as considered as bad as before. Before it used to be like a huge thing, like this person will be shamed. Nowadays it's not, because essentially he did not do anything wrong from this side. He might have hurt the other person's feeling, but he might be justified for doing it. So it's kind of dampened down a little bit. Okay, might not be the best example I use, but I was just trying to send the message through essentially. So I want you to make that connection because it's important for the LGBT, right? So whatever people do sexually has no moral bearing on it if there's consent. All right. In Islam, yes. It doesn't matter. 2, 3, 4, 10, makes no difference. Not laws. No. Individuals. Individuals. Yeah, so it's fine. So what we're talking about over here is sexual acts, which at one point the law was that it is wrong. Sodomy, forget about sodomy. Adultery. Just give me a second to explain. Adultery at one point in history, in the law was it's forbidden. It's you get punished. Good, okay. Now, because there's this whole idea in their mind that the body is now materialistic things, that we did not do anything wrong because there's consent. So what did they do? They challenged the law, and the law had to change. Right? So now what rules now is consent. If we decide, why is the law preventing us? Right? If it's between two people and no harm being done, right? Now once again, harm is very subjective, because you have to remember, in Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala designed everything fit together, and there is things that are placed in a specific way. Simple example, the importance of protecting the family unit. Without a family unit, there is no healthy society. Now, if we let this behavior happen, is there a healthy family? Yet they argue we're not harming anybody. No, you are harming the entire society. They just don't see it, or they don't want to admit it. That is completely two different things, but it's not what the reality is. Okay? Does that answer your question, Ajay? Okay. All right. Taib. In Islam, once again, that is that is balance between revelation, between reason, and between with other needs that are critical to the human flourishing, such as maintenance of family, right? But also cultivation of piety in Islam, that is important. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and along with the repeated command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, enjoin what is good and forbid what is evil, right? Those are all balanced. This is why this whole idea, when and it happens with a lot of kids in school, when somebody says, hey, what you're doing is wrong, they say, mind your own business. Is that right? I'm free to do what I want. No, in Islam it's not like that. In Islam, because it's understood that when something is wrong, is left unchecked in society and allowed to spread, it's going to cause harm to the larger society. This is why when you openly do something wrong, it becomes everybody's right to correct you. Right? But it is more of a Western ideology to emphasize freedom, right? My business, stay away from your business. Stay away from my business. Mind your own business. That can have room, but when it comes to things that are haram or wrong or immoral, Islam has another perspective on this. All right? So that being said, so these are the central ideas that are being placed, okay? And Islam has a different take on it. Not just that, by the way, other religions also have a take on it. But remember, what happened now in the Western society is this religion is taken out of what? Out of our daily lives, out of their daily lives, okay? It is no longer run. It is they themselves who decide things, and so they substituted these things in there to help guide whatever they want to do. Now, the other thing I want to do is I want to challenge the claim that desire, action, and identity are combined. And this is really important, right? Desire, action, and identity are combined. This is the contemporary Western liberalism's view on things, right? And that it is desire, behavior, and identities cannot be separated. It is fused, okay? You are what you desire. You are your actions, okay? You cannot separate those things. If you don't act upon your desires, you're not authentic to yourself. You'll never be happy. So those ideas are becoming, reiterated again. And once again, these are false ideologies. These are false, sense of correct understanding of things. Right? That's not the way it's done. So this paradigm, right? In this paradigm, if we understand this, we understand that identities such as, for example, gay, lesbian, queer, would be born. Okay. Remember, we're talking about combining desire, behavior, and identities. That word, right? The word, the paradigm, this is where the gay becomes an identity, right? Lesbian becomes an identity. Queer becomes an identity, because it's based on those things. So once again, actions and desires, they're not separate from your identity. So this is, to be honest, something that is very new in the contemporary West. This has not been like that in the past. This is something that is new. And as Muslims, we need to resist using that terminology, right? Because it is associated with un-Islamic beliefs and ideas. So the whole idea of inseparability between desire and identity and action is not how it is in Islam. And so if we don't separate them, it becomes more problematic to omit any sort of meaningful distinction between desire and action. Okay? If we don't argue this, then we can no longer argue that there is a moral distinction between action and a person's desire. And so the mere existence of a desire, right, becomes a moral junction for acting on it. Just because I feel I want to gives me the right to act upon it. Does it make sense? All right. Now, traditionally both in the East and West, I'll be honest, sexual behavior has been something of what an individual does. It's not something that a person is. So I'm talking about the changes that happen because of that mindset. So in the past, right, sexual behavior is something that somebody does. It is not something that somebody is. Now in the new paradigm, right, sexual behavior is what you are. Do you guys understand this or not? This is why, when they say gay or queer or lesbian, automatically reflects a action. They don't separate them. Okay? Type. Now, to begin, to start building an Islamic framework, we have to note that Islam does not categorize human beings on the basis of mere desire. It doesn't. Especially if this desire is towards an act that is deemed not only illicit, but also sometimes unnatural and deserving of punishment. So in Islam, it does not categorize a human being based on their mere desires. What does it categorize it based on? Type. Let's step back a little bit. So first of all, let's put things in place, okay? Islam does not categorize people based on their desires. Can we agree? Right? Can we agree? Okay, good. The other thing is that Sharia categorizes sexual acts as halal or haram. That's it. It doesn't matter what kind of act it is. It's either halal or haram. Okay? Now, once again, it does not categorize sexual identity. Is this a sexual act is either halal or haram. So halal sexual relations are those that are between a man and a woman in the bounds of a marriage contract. Anything else is haram. Okay? Now, the third thing is that Islam does not define or categorize people on the basis of their internal feelings, whether sexual or otherwise. Makes no difference. So it does not categorize people based on their inner feelings. Rather, it affirms our core identity as servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Defined, primarily in the terms of our belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our love and submission to Him, our devotion to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, obeying the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. All these things is what defines, in Islam, is what defines an person's identity. It's not their feelings or desires. Okay? And so, in this case, you'll notice that Sharia would differentiate between feelings, right, and acts. You'll differentiate between feelings and acts, right? But also it would differentiate between what happens in private, let's say private sins, and what is publicly advocated. Like that sin being advocated publicly. It differentiates between those two. If a person is privately sinning, does Sharia interfere with it? Does it tell the human beings to interfere with it? Okay, let me put this. If a person in an Islamic country is brewing his own alcohol at his home and secretly drinking it at home, does Sharia say anything about this person? No, it's not okay, but we don't interfere, okay? Now, if this person starts selling it publicly, then it is a good, excellent. Let's go back to this whole thing about sexual acts. If somebody is doing a sexual act privately in their home, does Sharia interfere? No. Okay. Now, if they advocate immoral, in our perspective, sexual behavior outside, do we interfere then? Yes. Okay. So there's that separation between desire, action, and then also privately doing something that is sinful, as opposed to publicly doing something that is sinful. In the Western society, is there any difference? Why not? Because what? Consent. Good. Because of consent. Because of freedom. Because I'm being true myself. I am, I am what I, my actions, my desires. So you see how that paradigm kind of, this. Well, we're going to have to argue on what is naked. I'm serious. We're going to argue on what's naked. My perspective of nakedness is completely different than their perspective of nakedness, right? And you can always push the limit, right? And in fact, it got to the point that, they had to minimize the what is considered nakedness to something that is just not even covering your, essentially just covering your genitalia. As long as it's covering your genitalia, you're not considered naked. That's it, right? So what are you going to do about that? Fine. Now, as Muslims, we use, so I want you to kind of just realize this. Sometimes we fall into that trap. So, when we're in Islamic perspective, as Muslims, we use descriptive terms and adjective, such as an individual, for example, who is experiencing same gender attraction. We don't call that person what? A person who has same gender attraction, what do they call him? In English, ya Sheikh. In English. A male who has same gender attraction, what do they call him? Good. A female that has same gender attraction, what do they call her? We don't use those terms. Why? Because that's automatically reinforces the whole thing about identity, desire, action, all the same. Okay? We fall into that trap, by the way. Okay? And some of the young individuals who would say, oh, my friend is this, right? Or I think I am this. Automatically in our brains, what that happens is it fuses all these together. But as Muslims, we have to make sure that we teach everybody that these are all separate. Actions, desires, and identity are separate, right? They're not necessarily all-inclusive. They're not, okay? Especially when it comes to feelings, right? I'll give you an example. I'm going to give you a very mundane example, right? When a person feels the urge to take something that doesn't belong to him or her because they want it, the Sharia punish them for it. Okay, is type. A person feels the urge, okay, and desire, like mashallah, like I don't know. Give me something that's nice. What do people want now? Good, the latest iPhone, okay, the latest iPhone, and it comes with its iPod. No, no iPod. What is it? What is it? It is the iPod, right? Huh? EarPod. Is it? I'm sorry, my terminology is. I don't like Apple products. I think we need to delete this from the YouTube, but that's okay. Right? I don't like it, but so that's why I don't pay attention to it. But anyway, earpods and is it not earpods? Is it called earpods? Or AirPods? Thank you, not earpods. Earpods is the fake one, the imitation stuff, the the Android stuff. Okay, so iPods. No, AirPods. I'm sorry, AirPods. All right, AirPods, phone, new phone, comes with AirPods and everything, right? It's sitting right there. And a person just showing it off like, oh, look at my, I don't know how many $1,000 they spend on it or $100. And then this person sitting there that has their, flip phone with them, okay? And they're like, man, I really want this phone, right? Oh, and it comes with AirPods, right? AirPods. It comes with AirPods too. Man, I really want this. I feel the urge, I want to take this. Okay? I want to take this. Is this person in Sharia judged as right or wrong? Will they be punished? They will not be punished, right? Why? Excellent. We separate between action and desires. Okay? We actually separate. So, in Western society, this person becomes automatically, their identity is an iPhone person. You're an Android guy. You're an iPhone person, right? It becomes identity. Believe it or not, it does become identities, right? People have to fashion their life around what they feel is that their identity. No, I'm an Android person. And so they actively, avoid Apple stuff. Guilty as charged over here, right? And then also on the other side, you see people who are I'm an Apple person. All of a sudden, all their stuff is Apple. Their watch is Apple. And I don't know, they start wearing T-shirts that are Apple. But it just becomes them, right? It is because this whole notion of desire, action, and identity are not separable. But it should be separable, okay? Now, you'd understand this. Let's say we'll talk about something that is just, what we consider normal, not a contention issue. Let's say a male, right, or a female have a strong desire towards towards each other. Okay? They have a strong desire towards each other. Are they punished for that desire? They're not. Okay. When are they punished? If they act upon it. Okay? Now, does that put an identity on them? It doesn't. Okay? It really doesn't. On the other hand, in the Western, point of view, that desire, right? If you don't act upon it, you're not going to be happy. You're miserable. Okay? But also, that desire that you have becomes your identity. You classify as, I'm this person, I'm that person, my inclinations, and so forth. Okay? طيب. Going back to the whole terminology, just talked about this because we're talking about terminology over here. Once again, we use adjectives, right? So this person has same gender attraction, or they're experiencing gender dysphoria as opposed to trans, right? The word trans reflects an identity, but in Sharia, I would use things such as gender dysphoria, and that was more of a clinical term, right? But we have problems with that term, by the way. I'm going to tell you why in the next second, inshallah. طيب. Now, this last part I'm going to talk about today. Oh, subhanAllah, good. So, last part I'm going to talk about. Do we have chai today or we don't? We do? Okay. Thank you. It was going to determine whether I finish early or not. It's good chai. Oh, you got some already, huh? So, alhamdulillah. All right. So, the last thing I'm going to talk about is challenging the narrative of denying any sort of normative connection between biological sex that you're born with, identity expression, like the gender identity expression, and sexual orientation. Essentially, I'm talking about biology, okay? The identity that reflects or expression that reflects that biology, but sexual orientation over here is the desire. Okay? Now, contemporary liberalism, what it does, it severs any sort of connection between biological sex from both gender identity and expression. They say there's no connection. Have you seen the genderbread man? Have you seen that picture? Genderbread man? No? This is what they show children in schools. The genderbread man. It plays on gingerbread man. The genderbread man. This is what they show kids in elementary. They'll have, like, their biological sex, what they're born with, but then they have a heart, and then they have the head, which shows their identity, or, like, their expression and identity of what they feel. They feel male or female. So essentially, they separate between all three: what you're born with, what you actually feel as your male or female, and what you actually attracted or desire, male or female. They separate between all of that. Okay? Is that understood? Yes? Right. So, what's interesting is that when we talk about these things, the separation is literally almost less than a decade ago, a person experiences a bit of a dissonance between their biological sex and their gender identity was something that's called gender identity disorder. Initially, what they called it was gender identity disorder. Now, this signaled an understanding that one's sex that they're born with, the gender, is based primarily on biology, okay? And it should match one's external sex and internal gender identification. So those are connected. So that term, when they used it, gender identity disorder, it indicates the understanding that your biological sex and how you express yourself or you think about yourself are connected. Is that clear? Yes? Right. Over time, that term changed from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria. Now, what is the issue? Is there a problem with that? It sounds nicer. It's shorter, right? Dysphoria? What does dysphoria mean, Sheikh? Define dysphoria. Dysphoria means there's a contention or conflict. No. So in the clinical diagnosis books, a person who feels that their identity as male or female is not the same as what they're born with, that was called gender identity disorder. That word later on changed to gender dysphoria. Okay? That's all I'm saying. Is there a problem with that? That's a good question. It sounds better. It's shorter. That's what I'm going to get at. That's what I'm going to get at in a second. Although it was there, but it's no longer considered a disorder, okay? So, what is now acceptable, right? So this is a condition that requires treatment, but not because it's a disorder, but the kind of treatment that you need to offer these people is the feeling of anxiety that they start feeling, right? And depression that they experience because they're struggling with their internal identity that they feel is different than what they're born with. That's why the name changed, okay? Type. Now, in Islam, on the other hand, right, according to Islamic guidance, obviously, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intentionally designed the human body, right? The human body is such that these three things are aligned, okay? We cannot avoid it. You're born as a male or a female. That will reflect in your body, whether it is at the level of psychology or physiology, whether how your brain is wired or whether how the chemicals in your body are, physiological how you are, physically how you become. Those are all together, okay? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only created two genders, the male and the female. And so Allah said, وَأَنَّهُ خَلَقَ الزَّوْجَيْنِ الذَّكَرَ وَالْأُنثَى, and He created the two mates, the male and the female. And Sharia makes no distinction, and Sharia makes no distinction between biological sex and what people in the West nowadays refer to as psychological gender. Do you know what that means, psychological gender? Why they use that? That is what you think you are. Okay? There is no distinction between the biological gender and psychological gender. So if a person is born as a male, in a male body, then the norm is that they will identify and express themselves as a male. Okay? If they were born biologically as a female, then they would identify and express themselves as a female. Now, if there is a disorder, okay, is that an exception or the rule? Good. Does the exception change the rule? خلاص, we're done. No, it does. It is not as a? That's it. Something that is not normal. So it is important that we identify whether something is within the normal range or not, because if it's not normal, we don't normalize it. We don't do that. That is the difference. Okay? That's the difference between when we have an Islamic perspective or a Western perspective. For a Western perspective, no matter how absurd it is, remember, this is your desire, this is you. You have the right to do whatever you feel as long as there is consent. And so it becomes normalized. In Sharia, it's not like that. Okay? طيب, alhamdulillah. طيب, so in Islam we understand that the two genders are also distinct, right? Yet complementary in nature. So they're distinct, but distinct because they complement one another. And they were intentionally created and designed to be companions to one another. And so when they are created this way, they're created to have attraction towards another. They're created to have traits that complement one another. And so we understand that despite their spiritual equality, right? Despite the spiritual equality between males and females, men and female are different on the practical level. Whether it is their physiological, their psychological, their physical, all these things are different, which means also why we understand in Sharia, I gave them different roles and rights and responsibilities that guide how they interact at the domestic level. It has to be that way, right? Because they're not treated the same because they are not created the same. Okay? Obviously, there's things that are equal and 100% the same, but the fact that there is psychological, physiological, and physical differences warrant that certain obligations are placed on each ones that are different, because they need to complement one another. Okay? And so men and women differ in once again various biological, psychological, even dispositional, right? And psychological ways that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created that intentionally in them. And the differences, these differences are actually now rejected in the liberal Western thought, right? And in fact, it's resisted. That's like extreme leftist ideology. Now, what's interesting is that there is actually scientific documentation of this, even though it's being denied. There is scientific documentation of this. So I'll give you an example, right? So 2017, right? A publication by the author. His name is Leonard Sachs. He published in a book. He said, "Why Gender Matters." Right? Why gender matters? What parents and teachers need to know about the emerging science of sex differences. So he's acknowledging that there is sex differences. Stephen Rhodes, that was published in 2005. He says taking sex differences seriously, and then 2020, which is a bit more of a recent publication, sex differences in brain anatomy. Okay, so these are scientists that are admitting that there is differences, but once again, the ideology, Western ideology, especially the leftist ideology, wants to remove all these things and says there is no differences. Now, ultimately, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who created our bodies, has categorical prerogative to endow them with meaning and to place whatever limits He wants on them. Okay? And it's not for us really to devise purposes or assign meaning based on our own accord. That has to be done by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so this whole slogan of my body, my choice is not really true. Why not? Is it really your body? Who does it belong to? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Good. Is it really your choice? No, it's not our choice. It's Allah who tells us what to do with it. Well, whether they submit or not, the reality belongs to Allah. Right? Whether they like it or not, it belongs to Allah. All right? So the reality is, whether they like it or not, it belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whether they like it or not, there are rules that they're supposed to use their bodies for. Okay? And so Muslims, we understand this. And so that whole idea of my body, my choice is really very anti-ethical, right? Antithetical to Islam itself. Because it challenges Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's moral authority, essentially. And so the right thing is, Allah gave us this body, it's our responsibility, and He told us what to do with it. What is permissible and what is not permissible, right? That's the Islamic paradigm with it. And it's really important because, especially when we're talking about, some people that might have that, whatever we call it, dysphoria or same gender attraction, whatever the case is, when you frame it for them this way, it becomes easier for them to do what is right. Because they understand that, yes, I might have this feeling, but I'm not free to do what I want and act upon those desires, similar to how a heterosexual is not allowed to act upon their desires. It's the same thing, right? It's those boundaries. That conversation becomes a lot easier when you move away all that misconception of the ideologies that kind of has been placed in the media, being taught in school. It becomes a lot easier. Now, one thing I wanted to mention is once again that the majority of want to mention that the majority of the rules associated with Islamic gender and sexual paradigm can be understood by understanding the bounds and the permissibilities of sexual activity within Islamic law is really made to fulfill a higher objective, right? And that is to protect the family and lineage. All these rules and regulations are put in place to protect family and lineage. That's why they're there. Because without that, life becomes very difficult. All right, so I'm going to take the last few more minutes to challenge the whole equivalence between race, gender, and sexual identity and behavior. Because this is a tool that is being used, right? And next week, inshallah, next week, we're going to have a halqa next week? Eid will be done, right? Yeah, we'll have a halqa next week, inshallah. Can't give you guys too much of a break. So, what this is referring really is to the how contemporary liberalism draws an equivalence between race, gender, and sexual identity or behavior. Meaning that there are human rights, right? There are specific human rights, and we understand and we value human rights. And part of that human right is not to discriminate. We understand that, right? Not to discriminate. Not to discriminate someone for their race or gender. We understand that, right? Just because a person is from Africa or from Europe or from from China or from the South, Eastern Asian countries, does not mean that they have different rights. Okay? And also males and females does not mean we don't treat them equally, of course within the bounds of what Islam had legislated. So we don't discriminate someone based on their race or gender. We don't. So no one generally argues against this. Is there any argument against this? Is there argument against this? Can anybody argue we can discriminate based on gender or race? All right, we should be all on the same page, by the way. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to see nods. Can we discriminate based on race? If you say it's okay, then we got to change this halaqas to something else. Okay? All right, thank you. No, we cannot argue this. Okay, alhamdulillah. Like this is going back to the time of the Prophet ﷺ. We gotta, what are you talking about? طيب. So, now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did create us with different lineage from different races, different languages, genders, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it that this is not within our control. Okay? Can you control who you're born to? Or where you're born? Or what your gender would be? Good. Now, can you control your actions? Okay, if you can't control your actions, what are you? What? Yes, thank you. Say that word again. Insane. If you can't control your actions, you are. That's why, like, we give excuses to people who are insane, right? They have no control over their actions. Okay, or you're a child. Right, let's be okay. Or you're a child. Okay, children can't control their actions. Okay, they have their brain don't have the capacity to self-regulate and control, and so they'll do certain things. But anyway, so to draw a parallel, an equivalence between something that is out of your control and something that is within your control is completely false. Okay? To draw an equivalence, to make equal between something that is out of your control and something that is in your control is false. Okay? Because I can easily argue that a person can argue, hey, it's not in my control that I want to be promiscuous, right? Why are you being racist against me? Why are you putting me down? This is how I'm created, right? I need to go around and do whatever I can because it's just an internal urge, right? Why am I being punished by the law for this? Why am I being looked down upon, right? This is racist. Is that a good argument? Is that a good argument? No, it's not a good argument. Why? Because this person could control themselves. This is an action. You can control actions. Okay? So, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not judge us for our race and our gender, but He judges us for our actions. Okay? Now, this whole parallel between equating between gender, race, race, gender, and sexuality is on purpose by the LGBT movement. It is on purpose. Because when you try to argue having that kind of behavior is wrong, they accuse you of being a bigot. Why? Because they combine between them. Just ask simply, why am I a bigot? Or you're discriminating against me. I'm like, where's the discrimination? I'm talking about an action, not you as an individual, right? Since when you are your action? Oh wait, that's what they think, right? Their identity is based on their desire and their action. You see how all this is causing that narrative, right? And it's based on these premises that we need to take apart. This is how we argue this, but it's important how we talk to our children about this. As they're growing older, we have to teach them that Allah does not judge for our feelings, right? Allah judges for our actions. So even if you become angry, right? If you control your anger, you're not punished. But if you do something act upon your anger and you go overboard, then you will be punished. It's those things, that little messages that are important. Okay? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us as males and as females. You teach them how to behave like a proper male and how to behave like a proper female. Okay? And I do understand that there's a bit of a contention and fear of going overboard, but as long as you practice Islam properly, you'll be able to do these things properly, right? There is proper masculinity. It does not should not be scared of how to act like a masculine individual. You're not being a male chauvinist. No, we're talking about Islamic masculinity, Islamic femininity, right? Is there a gray area? Sometimes there is, right? There are boundaries, of course there are. Wallahu a'lam. طيب, yes. Okay, so the whole argument is that they're trying to say that if you don't allow people to perform that act, you are a bigot. This is a human right similar to race and gender. That's what their argument is. We're saying no, that they are different. That's it. No, they're saying that they're the same. They have the same human rights. So similar that uh, you cannot discriminate against a race. You should not discriminate against a sexual act. No, they're drawing a parallel between it. No, they're drawing a parallel between it. This is why, for example, the marital laws in some states are changing, right? Like in the law, it's supposed to be marriage supposed to be between a male and a female. Now the law is changing. Why? Because you're discriminating if you don't. How is that discrimination, right? That's the question. Allah. Jazakumullah khair. Alhamdulillah, for the first time, I think I gave you guys 15 minutes for your chai. But as usual, I know you guys will probably sit here until 10:13, like 2 minutes before the iqamah. Do you guys have any questions? Type. Next time, what I'm going to talk about now is hopefully, inshallah, kind of end of this. We're going to talk about more of addressing some of the misconceptions like posed by the LGBT advocates that justify their movement. So we're talking about things such as this is how I'm born, right? Or whatever these different arguments. And how to respond to some of the LGBT advocates at a very, in a very political way. And then how we can engage and serve those who are struggling with same-gender attraction, for example. Okay, because the reality is, living in this country, some of the youth were affected with that. And so some of them might seriously have a genuine, same gender attraction, for example. How do we help them and help them navigate through it? Okay? Wallahu a'lam. Yes? Yes. So I don't see the I don't see why you think they're opposing. In fact, the parents are reinforcing that idea. So if the Western notion of happiness is acting upon your desire, and the mother keeps saying, as long as my child is happy, isn't that reinforcement? No, so we should separate between the Islamic teachings and Muslim behavior. Okay? Two different things. Yes. We need to separate between those. We cannot, now I said this before, we are children of our environment. So unconsciously, sometimes we'll see certain things and repeat certain things without really reflecting on it. But unfortunately, even it makes us disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just so that we can please our children. I'll give you a simple example, and I see this across the board, especially with mothers. Okay? When it comes to train their kids to pray Salat al-Fajr. Okay? Now, in winter, it's not a problem. They'll wake them up. It's like 6 o'clock in the morning. They pray, right? And then they get ready to go to school. But when Fajr becomes 3:30 in the morning or 4 o'clock in the morning, they say, no, right? He's going to be very cranky. She's going to be very cranky. They need to sleep, right? I feel bad for them. I don't want them to be happy, right? But no, that violates what Allah told you to do. It does. And it creates inconsistency that later on we will pay for when that child is inconsistent with getting up for Fajr, because that's how we trained them. That's it, right? This child will say, man, summer is just too early. I'll just pray when I get up. My mom used to do this with me, okay? In winter, they're like, no, I'm going to get up for winter. Of course, I have no choice, right? See, unintentionally we do these things and we feed and reinforce certain ideas, right? But that concept, right, it should not be how it's supposed to be practiced in Islam. Okay? It comes from this sometimes a distorted idea of what is good and what is bad, and that is completely wrong, right? It's not. Okay, it's not how it's supposed to be. Now I know I mentioned the mothers. Some fathers do it, I have to admit, but mothers are a bit more emotional with their kids, and so that's what's going to happen. At least that's what I see most of the time, especially when I talk about Fajr prayer and parenting. That question comes up. Well, actually, what's interesting? Let me tell you something interesting. Scientifically, right? This is a scientific paper that has been shown. It said it's a lot healthier for people, and they get better sleep if they get up in the middle of the night. So that 8-hour sleep, okay, it is healthier if it's divided. What does that remind you of? Tahajjud. Right? Islam legislated something. Wallahi, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's best for us. Right? This whole thing, I can't, I need my full 8 hours of sleep. No, you don't. Right? Maybe you might, but it doesn't have to be in a row. But waking up a child in the middle of the night, which is really Fajr, and then telling them to go back to sleep, actually might be healthier for them, believe it or not. Right? Wallah. Yes, I am. I don't think they've figured that out yet. Allah Alam. I don't know. I have no idea. Yes. I don't understand the question, Sheikh. I'm sorry. Oh, okay. The LGBT community. And they accepted Islam. Okay. So this is not the first time that we deal with this. In fact, there's have you ever heard of Wahid Jensen? So this person, I really advise people to. So he has a podcast. It's called Beyond the Rainbow. Okay, Beyond the Rainbow. And he was a non-Muslim that belonged to that community, and then accepted Islam. Okay, and he talks about his journey and ideology and the whole idea of submission. We have to understand that a huge part of it is understanding mentally, right, the whole idea of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's no longer, once again, it's a theocentric. It's Allah becomes the center, not us, not our desires. It's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us what is right, what is wrong, and we understand that is what is better for us. If they understand that concept, right, then everything else falls in place. It's that impulse, for example, that you want to lie, or impulse that you want to have illicit sexual behavior. That becomes controlled because you understand now that this is wrong. Everything else falls in place the same way. Hold on. Yes. Who? Who's against what? What movement? Who's against it? Yeah, who's against it? I think anybody that, majority of people who align themselves with what's considered a scripture. Right? No, of course not, because it's political suicide. Were you here, Sheikh, the first halaqah? We talked about this, right? We talked about how this movement grew to the point that it becomes an attack, right? And anybody that defies, because you become categorized as, it becomes weaponized, right? And so people now are pressured, and so no politician will ever dare to speak against it, even if they believe it's wrong, right? Even if they prescribe to a Catholic Orthodox worldview, whatever the case is, because essentially they'll say there's the politics in the world, and there's church and home. Well, no, they're changing, obviously. Yeah. Yeah, no, they're changing, but once again, but the majority of the Christians will not accept it. Yeah, the majority of Christians will not accept it. The majority, obviously, the Muslims are not going to accept it. The majority of Jews are not going to accept it. Even like forget about that. Even like if you go back to the other countries around the world, right, the majority of the population will not accept it. But who has the access to media, right? Who has access to publication, education, all these things? It's not us anymore. Hold on. طيب. I think I'm going to have to hard stop now for the adhan and whatever chai you guys can drink in 5 minutes. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم.
इसको वो करना पड़ता है पार्टी वगैरह होती तब होता है ना, पिछले 3-4 दिन से कुछ भी नहीं हुआ. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله